In the summer of 2024, I experienced something I can barely bring myself to write about. It's haunted me every single day since, and I'm hoping that sharing it here might finally bring me some peace, or at least a way to stop looking over my shoulder every time the wind rustles through the trees. It started on a muggy evening in July. I live in a small town surrounded by thick woods, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing much ever happens. That night, the sky was an eerie mix of orange and gray, the kind of twilight that makes you feel like you're stuck in a dream. The air was thick and sticky, buzzing with the hum of cicadas. Even the animals seemed agitated, the occasional bark of a dog or screech of an owl punctuating the oppressive quiet. I was walking home from my friend Rachel's house, cutting through the woods to save time. I'd taken this path countless times before. It wasn't well-trodden, but it was direct, and I knew every twist and turn by heart. The canopy of leaves above me blotted out most of the fading light, casting the trail into deep shadow. I remember thinking how strange it felt that night, though. The woods were too quiet, almost as if they were holding their breath. About halfway through, I noticed something unusual. A light. It was faint and flickering, like a lantern swaying in the breeze, and it seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, off the path. At first, I thought it might be campers, but this wasn't a place people usually camped. It was dense and wild, and there weren't any clearings nearby. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped off the trail, pushing through the underbrush toward the light. The closer I got, the colder the air became. It didn't make sense. The day had been sweltering, and the heat hadn't relented even after sunset. But here, in this part of the woods, the temperature seemed to drop with every step. I remember shivering and wrapping my arms around myself as I approached the light. And then I saw it. In a small clearing stood a decrepit cabin I'd never seen before. Its wooden walls were warped and rotting, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. The light I'd followed was coming from a single window, its glass cracked and filthy. It flickered like candlelight, casting strange shadows on the surrounding trees. My gut told me to turn around and leave, but my legs seemed to have a mind of their own. Before I knew it, I was stepping onto the rickety porch, the boards creaking under my weight. I peered through the window, cupping my hands around my face to block out the last remnants of daylight. Inside, the room was sparse, furnished only with a wooden table and 2 chairs. On the table sat a candle, its flame dancing in the draft that seemed to come from nowhere. But what froze me in place was what I saw beyond the table. A figure, barely visible in the gloom, standing perfectly still in the far corner of the room. It was tall and thin, its head tilted slightly as if listening. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting, locked onto me even though its face was obscured. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The woods seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing closer, their branches clawing at my arms as I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I tore through the underbrush, ignoring the scratches and cuts that littered my arms and legs. The only thought in my head was to get out, to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. When I finally burst onto the main road, I collapsed onto the asphalt, gasping for air. The world felt too bright and too loud after the oppressive silence of the woods. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen that night. Who would believe me? A ghost story about a cabin in the woods? I'd sound like a lunatic. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find my bedroom freezing cold. No matter how hot the day had been, objects in my house would move on their own. A glass left on the counter would be on the floor in the morning, or my keys would vanish only to reappear in places I'd never leave them. And then there were the dreams. Vivid, horrifying dreams of the cabin, of that figure standing in the corner, watching, waiting. The worst came one night in late August. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. It was coming from my window. My heart pounded as I turned my head, my eyes locking onto the glass. There, silhouetted against the moonlight, was the figure. Its head was tilted, just like before, and it was tapping one long skeletal finger against the pane. Tap, tap, tap. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. The next thing I knew, my neighbor was pounding on my front door, yelling to see if I was okay. When I finally opened it, trembling and incoherent, I could only point to the window. But when we looked, there was nothing there. Just the faint outline of a handprint smeared across the glass. I moved out of that house a week later, packed up everything and left without looking back. I've tried to convince myself it was all in my head, a trick of the light or a series of bad dreams. But sometimes late at night, I'll feel that same cold chill, and I'll remember the way its gaze felt. Like it wasn't just looking at me, but threw me into the deepest parts of who I am. And I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, waiting for me to come back. If you're here for the first time, make sure to subscribe to our channel and tap the bell icon so you never miss a terrifying story. Your support means so much to us. Be sure to share these eerie tales with your friends and family. Thank you for being part of our community. Now, let's jump into the next story. It happened on a rainy October night in 2024. I was working the graveyard shift at the petrol station just off the highway, a lonely outpost surrounded by thick woods on one side and an endless stretch of asphalt on the other. The kind of place where the only sound is the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional rumble of a passing semi-truck. It was quiet, as usual, with only the rhythmic tapping of rain against the windows to keep me company. Little did I know, that night would haunt me forever. The first few hours of my shift passed without incident. I restocked the shelves, mopped the floor, and stared at the security monitors, hoping for something to break the monotony. The weather outside was brutal. Sheets of rain poured down, blurring the view of the dimly lit forecourt. The wind howled, rattling the old windows, and the temperature had dropped so low that I could see my breath fogging up the glass when I leaned against it. It felt like the kind of night where the world was trying to warn you to stay indoors, but I had no choice. Around 1:30 a.m., a car pulled into the lot. It was an old, beat-up sedan, the kind you'd expect to see abandoned in a junkyard. Its headlights cut through the rain as it parked by the pumps, but no one got out. I watched from behind the counter, my stomach tightening with unease. Something about the car felt wrong. Maybe it was the way it had appeared so suddenly, as if it had materialized from the darkness. Or maybe it was the fact that the engine kept running, the faint purr audible even over the storm. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Still, no one emerged. I glanced at the security monitors again, trying to get a clearer look, but the rain distorted the image. Finally, I decided to go outside and check. Grabbing my jacket, I stepped into the downpour, the cold biting through my clothes instantly. I approached the car cautiously, my footsteps splashing in the puddles. When I reached the driver's side, I knocked on the window. No response. The glass was fogged up, making it impossible to see inside. I knocked again, harder this time, and called out, "Hey, you okay in there?" Still nothing. My heart was pounding now, a mix of fear and frustration. I tried the door handle, and to my surprise, it opened with a creak. The interior was empty. The driver's seat was vacant, and there were no signs of anyone else in the car. But what struck me most was the smell, a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach churn. It reminded me of rotting fruit left too long in the sun, but there was something else to it, something metallic and sharp. My instincts screamed at me to back away, but I couldn't move. My eyes were drawn to the rearview mirror, which was tilted downward as if someone had been staring into the back seat. I followed its angle, and that's when I saw it. A small, blood-stained handprint smeared across the inside of the rear window. I stumbled back, nearly slipping in the wet gravel. My heart raced as I scanned the area, looking for any signs of the driver or anyone. The woods loomed ominously in the distance, their twisted branches swaying in the storm. I shouted into the darkness, my voice barely carrying over the wind. "Is anyone there?" No answer. Only the relentless rain and the eerie creak of the trees. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. My hands trembled as I grabbed the phone to call the police. But when I lifted the receiver, there was no dial tone. The line was dead. I cursed under my breath and turned to the security monitors. The car was still there, its headlights cutting through the rain like two unblinking eyes. But then I noticed something else. A figure standing at the edge of the forecourt, just beyond the glow of the lights. First, I thought it was my imagination. The rain distorted the image, making the figure appear blurry and insubstantial. But as I stared, it became clearer. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in a long coat that flapped in the wind. He was facing the petrol station, but his face was obscured by shadows. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching. Panic surged through me. I checked the door to make sure it was locked, then grabbed the baseball bat we kept under the counter. My mind raced with possibilities. Who was this man? Why was he just standing there? And why didn't he come inside if he needed help? Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The man remained motionless, a dark silhouette against the storm. Then, without warning, he began to move. Slowly, deliberately, he walked toward the station, his footsteps silent on the rain-soaked pavement. My breath caught in my throat as he reached the door and stopped. For a moment, we were separated only by a thin pane of glass. I could see him more clearly now. His face was pale and expressionless, his eyes dark and sunken, as if he hadn't slept in years. He raised a hand and tapped on the glass, the sound sharp and hollow. I froze, gripping the bat tightly. My instincts screamed at me to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there like a deer in headlights. But I couldn't move. The man tapped again, harder this time, and then he smiled. It was the kind of smile that sent chills down your spine, wide and unnatural, as if his face didn't quite know how to form the expression. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the station into darkness. I heard the door rattle, as if he was trying to force it open. My pulse thundered in my ears as I backed away, the bat trembling in my hands. The emergency lights kicked in, casting a dim, eerie glow over the room. I glanced at the monitors, but they showed nothing, only static. When I looked back at the door, the man was gone. I scanned the forecourt, the parking lot, and the woods beyond, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. My legs felt like jelly as I sank to the floor, my back pressed against the counter. I stayed there for what felt like hours, clutching the bat and jumping at every sound. Eventually, the storm began to subside, and the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. The power came back on, and the phones were working again. I called the police and told them everything, but when they arrived, there was no evidence of the man or the blood-stained handprint. The car was still there, abandoned and reeking of that sickly sweet odor, but nothing else seemed out of place. To this day, I don't know who or what that man was. The petrol station has since been demolished, replaced by a shiny new complex that erases any trace of what happened that night. But I'll never forget his face, his smile, or the way he seemed to melt into the storm. And every time it rains, I can't help but feel like he's still out there, watching, waiting. Back in 2024, I moved to North Dakota for work. It was supposed to be temporary, a year at most, but I ended up staying for 3. I'm originally from Montana, so every couple of weeks, I'd drive back home on my days off. Most of the time, I'd leave super late at night, which meant driving for hours in pitch-black darkness. The trip was about 3.5 hours, and a big chunk of it was on this winding 2-lane highway cutting through completely uninhabited land. On a typical drive, I'd pass maybe 1 or 2 cars the entire time. There's this one stretch of road on Highway 16 that always gave me the creeps. There aren't even houses way off in the distance. Just endless darkness. It's the kind of place where you feel like the only living soul for miles. The first weird thing happened one night when I was heading back to North Dakota. I just hit the halfway point, where the highway follows a river for a bit. The road was as dark as ever. So dark it didn't even feel normal. I've never been the type to believe in ghosts or demons or whatever, but something about that night just felt off. As I drove along, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I glanced toward the river and saw this thick fog rolling in. At first I thought, okay, fog happens. But this wasn't normal fog. It wasn't low-hanging mist or moisture in the air. It was a huge, isolated cloud, like someone had dropped a chunk of storm into the river. It had sharp edges, almost like it had a shape, and it moved as a whole like it had its own mind. I slowed down, squinting to make sense of it, and realized I wasn't paying attention to the road anymore. Up ahead, I saw the sign warning about the sharp corner coming up, so I refocused and prepared to turn. That's when I slammed on the brakes. Hard. In the middle of the road was this massive, hazy gray shape, kind of like a cloud, but tall and rounded. It looked exactly like the fog I'd just seen on the river, but now it was blocking the highway. I skidded to a stop, my heart pounding, and stared at it, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. It didn't spread out like normal fog. It had distinct edges, like it was contained somehow. I blinked, and it was gone. That was just the beginning. The next time something happened, I was heading back to Montana. It was around 3:30 a.m., and I was coming up on that same stretch of highway. I was speeding a bit, listening to music, when I rounded a bend and saw something on the shoulder of the road. A person. It looked like an old man with a walking stick, hunched over and wearing a long brown cloak that reminded me of animal hide. I slowed down, both because I didn't want to hit him and because, what was this guy doing walking along a highway in the middle of nowhere? The nearest town was 40 miles away. There were no houses, no cars, nothing. As I got closer, my headlights hit his back, and he turned to look at me. That's when I saw them, his eyes. They were dark red, glowing almost. I couldn't make out any other features, just those terrifying eyes. I tried to convince myself I was seeing things, that it was too dark to really know what I saw, but the image burned itself into my mind. Not even 10 minutes later, something else crossed the road in front of me. At first, I thought it was an animal, but it was walking on two legs, hunched over, just like the man. As it moved, it turned to look at me, and there they were again, those same red eyes. I hit the gas, locked my doors, and didn't stop until I hit the interstate. But the worst encounter happened a few weeks later. I was driving back to Montana, and my tire pressure light came on. Great. I pulled over to check, and sure enough, my back tire was flat. Just my luck. I was right by that cursed river, and of course, there was no cell service. I grabbed my flashlight and leaned out the window to assess the damage. That's when I saw it. A shadow, a tall, human-like figure running toward my car. Fast. I panicked and scrambled back inside, locking the doors and rolling up the windows. The shadow disappeared, but I could hear it. Footsteps slamming against the pavement. I cracked my window, trying to listen, and immediately regretted it. Heavy, wet breathing like it was inches from me. My car wouldn't start. I tried over and over, and nothing. I was crying, praying, and then suddenly, it roared to life. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, flat tire and all. A while later, I told my friend Matt about it. He'd lived in North Dakota for work a few years before me and had made that same drive countless times. Before I could even finish, he said, "Highway 16? Yeah, I've seen some things out there." When I told him my story, he went pale, left the room, and came back with an old notebook. He flipped to a page and handed it to me. Written inside was his story. A hunched man with glowing red eyes on the highway and, 10 miles later, a shadowy creature that looked just like him. We'd seen the exact same thing. Years apart. Even now, I don't know what to make of it. But whatever it was, I'm convinced it wasn't human. I don't know who else to tell. I've burned every bridge. Family, friends, even casual acquaintances. When I ran off with Jake, I was chasing some twisted fantasy of a better life. I thought I'd become someone larger than life, daring and wild, the kind of person who makes people turn their heads. But I couldn't have been more wrong. I got to the house just after sunset. It felt smaller than I remembered, slouched under a bruised sky that seemed ready to crush it. The realtor had called it cozy. Standing there now, I saw it for what it was, a husk. The white paint was flaking off like it had given up, and the windows were caked with grime so thick it turned the glass into a dull fog. This was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place to drown out the world and let grief quietly devour me. Jake's accident had ripped through my life, leaving nothing but a hollow shell of who I used to be. I thought I could hide here, in this forgotten house, and let myself unravel in peace. But as I stood there on the cracked porch, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had been waiting for me. The air was heavy, like the house was holding its breath. I shook my head and told myself I was just tired. Dragging my suitcase inside, I shut the door behind me. The sound echoed too loudly, bouncing off walls that felt too close. The smell hit me next. A mix of damp wood and something faintly metallic, like the ghost of old blood. That night, I threw myself onto the bed, still wrapped in Jake's sweatshirt. The fabric had long since lost his scent, but I clung to it anyway, as if it could tether me to who I used to be. Sleep didn't come easy. The wind screamed around the house, rattling the windows like it was trying to get in. Around midnight, I heard it, a single, deliberate footstep in the hallway. I froze, every muscle locked, my breath caught in my throat. I finally forced myself out of bed to check, but the hall was empty, just shadows stretching too far and a silence that felt alive. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just my imagination. The days started to blur. I spent hours pacing through the house, my steps echoing against creaky floorboards. It felt like the house was talking to me, its groans and whispers bleeding into my thoughts. Objects began to vanish. Small things at first. My toothbrush, a spoon, the book I'd been reading. I told myself it was grief making me scatterbrained. But then, I'd find those objects in places they didn't belong. A single shoe in the sink, my phone under the bed with the screen cracked. And then there was the mirror. It hung in the upstairs hallway, an ornate frame that didn't match the rest of the house. At first, it was just subtle things. My reflection moving a split second slower than me, or shadows flickering where they shouldn't. I ignored it, or at least I tried to. But one night, as I walked past it, I caught her. My reflection. Except it wasn't me. She stood there, staring out at me, her eyes wide and glassy like a doll's. Her face was slack, but there was something alive in her gaze. Something hungry. I couldn't move. My chest felt tight, like invisible hands were squeezing the breath out of me. Then, without warning, she moved. Her hand shot up, slamming against the glass with a force that shook the mirror. I stumbled back, gasping, but when I looked again, it was just me staring back, pale, wide-eyed, and trembling. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out hollow. I avoided the mirror for days, refusing to let my eyes linger on its surface. But avoidance didn't work. The whispers started soon after. At first, they were faint, like a distant voice carried on the wind. But as the days wore on, they grew louder, clearer. Jake's voice, soft and familiar but not quite right, as if someone had learned how to mimic him and was still working out the finer details. He called my name, told me he wasn't gone, that he was here, trapped in the house. At first, I clung to the sound, desperate to believe. But his words turned venomous. "You let me die," he hissed one night as I sat alone in the dark. "You should have saved me. You should be here with me." The whispers followed me everywhere, circling me like predators. The missing objects came back too, but they weren't the same. My old coffee mug now had a hairline crack that oozed something black. A stuffed bear appeared on my bed, its button eyes sewn on crooked. A photograph of a man I didn't know turned up in the kitchen, his face scratched out so violently the paper tore. And always the mirror watched. No matter where I went in the house, I felt its pull. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch her, the woman in the glass. She looked like me, but her eyes tracked my movements, and her mouth twisted into a smile that felt more like a threat. Once I tried to cover it with a sheet, but the sheet was always gone when I returned. The mirror never stayed hidden for long. Then, last night, everything came undone. I woke to the sound of glass shattering. My stomach dropped as I sat up, my pulse thundering in my ears. I didn't need to see it to know it was the mirror. I crept into the hallway, every step feeling like a mistake. The shards glinted on the floor like tiny knives, and in the center of the broken glass, she stood. Not my reflection. Not anymore. She was taller now, her body shimmering and shifting, like smoke trying to take a solid shape. Her face was mine but wrong. Too sharp, too hollow. And she was smiling, her mouth splitting her face in two. "Come with me," she whispered, her voice sharp and cold, like the edge of a blade. "Jake's waiting." I ran, but the house warped around me, the walls groaning and stretching like they were alive. Her footsteps were close behind, sharp and relentless, like the ticking of a clock counting down. Now, I'm here, hiding in the attic, my back pressed against the splintered wood. The whispers are louder than ever, Jake's voice tangled with hers, calling me, begging me, demanding me to give in. The door is creaking open now. The mirror is gone, and I think she is too. I live in a tiny town called Mill Creek, somewhere in rural Oregon. You've probably never heard of it. And trust me, it's small. We're talking fewer than 300 people, max. Honestly, I liked it that way. The peace, the quiet. It's why I moved here in the first place. But now, I'm starting to second-guess that decision. It all started shortly after I bought this place. My house is perched near a small drop-off that slopes down into a wooded area with a creek running through it. Keep that detail in mind, it's kind of key to this whole thing. About a week after moving in, I glanced out my kitchen window and noticed something odd. A trail. It wasn't there before. It stretched up from the creek and ended right outside the fence at the edge of my property. Like something or someone had walked up the hill and stopped there. First, I brushed it off. But then, a week later, things got weirder. It was late, maybe midnight, and I couldn't sleep. I decided to make some tea and zone out with a movie. As I stood in the kitchen, I heard leaves rustling outside. You know that sound, it's faint but distinct. It was coming from the direction of that trail. Curious and a little uneasy, I peeked out the window. That's when I saw someone, or something, bolting down the drop-off toward the creek. My stomach dropped. Was it a vandal? A thief? I didn't know, but I wasn't about to wait and find out. I started keeping a diary to document everything, just in case I'd need evidence for the cops later. Here's what I wrote. November 3rd. It happened again tonight. I was almost asleep when I heard footsteps running up from the valley. Who is this? Why are they coming up from that direction? I know there are a few shady folks living down by the creek, but still, November 12th. They cut my fence tonight. I woke up to a loud noise around 11 p.m. and ran to check it out. My spotlight showed the fence cleanly cut through, like someone used bolt cutters. It's unsettling. Why go to the trouble of cutting the fence and not doing anything else? Are they trying to scare me? I've added a bolt to the gate, but it feels like it won't stop them if they're determined. November 15th. This morning, the entire side fence was flattened. Someone sliced straight through it on both ends. I called the police. They said they'd investigate, but honestly, I'm not holding my breath. November 18th. Cops arrested some of the folks living by the creek. Apparently, they were causing trouble around town, so maybe this is over now. November 23rd. Guess not. Last night, someone smashed my window, the one that faces the drop-off. I didn't even hear it happen. There were weird scratch marks around the frame, too. Called the police again. December 1st. It's not the Creek people. They're all still in custody. This morning, I found massive footprints in my yard, way too big to belong to a person. I've ordered a CCTV system to figure out what's going on. December 5th. I'm out. I've moved out of the house and won't be going back. The last straw was watching the security footage. On 2 separate nights, I saw shadows lingering just beyond the tree line. Then, on my final night there, I saw it. Something long and spindly crept out from the trees. An arm, followed by a tall, gaunt figure, crawled up the hill and into my yard. For hours, it just stood there, staring at my window. And it wasn't alone. Others like it emerged from the trees. They stood together, as if waiting for something.